Good morning, everybody. Glad you could join us if you're here. I am going to go over some housekeeping things before we jump right into class. And we have a few folks who've added to the class. So this is also for their benefit, folks who are catching up, but also some folks who, for whatever reason, couldn't join us on Monday. Just gonna do a couple of things housekeeping wise. So first and foremost, welcome everybody. We are sort of defecting from Zoom. It's got a lot of problems, and literally millions of people in the country are trying to use it at the same time, from pre-K to all the way to higher education. And then of course, every teleworking industry is also, not necessarily every, but many teleworking industries are also relying heavily on it. So its bandwidth is really stretched. And on the first day of classes, Zoom crashed multiple times. So I'm really glad that we're using this alternative modality, YouTube. It's fun, it's funky. We have a lot of options. We don't have every option, but this is sort of pandemic time, and that's okay. We also have the students, all of you are all over the place, right? Because the pandemic means that some people got stuck in places. Some people wanted to wait it out at home because that's where you have the best support structures, and it's often where we feel safest. Not always, but it's often where we feel safest, right? So people are on multiple different time zones. There are people who are 12 and more hours ahead. There are people who are several hours behind still. So for whom making mandatory classes really isn't fair, and requiring participation in those isn't fair to everyone. And so we're going to use YouTube to make things as accessible as possible, also a little bit fun. You can participate in the live chat. If you have the capacity to do so, if you have the option, you can use text to voice if you want to talk your answers into a text form in chat. If you feel like you don't type, or if you're on your phone or something like that, and want to type faster. So some quick things, and just feel free to pop in and say hello, but absolutely no obligation to do so. So Mondays and Thursdays are when we have our class. And actually, you know what? Let me make sure that I have shared the most recent sorry about the feedback, with class. I don't think that I sent that out, so sorry about that. But it's okay. Everybody can catch up. So it's not, that's also the great thing about this. The other great thing about using YouTube is that we can interact with it even after the live stream is done. So we have the discussion, there's always the comment section. And this is closed, it's unlisted. So it's private to us, and nobody else has access to it but you all. So that is going to be a great thing, but it also means that we can, so when I upload it in Blackboard, you have it there, but when I upload it in Perusal, you can also actually tag sections and ask questions about those later, or interact with your colleagues' comments or questions, right? So it's still really interactive even after the fact, which is something that we can't do with any of the other options. So that's also another reason I really like it. I just sent a really bare bones email out to class. It's literally just the announcement of the link. Because I realized I didn't send that email. I was taking care of a couple other things. All right. So what other announcements do I need to take care of right now? Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. So now that I have sent the link out, and I'm sure everybody was panicking. Sorry about that. They will have gotten this, and we'll have a few more folks join. Oh, there's everybody. Hi. Sorry about the link delay. I neglected to send it ahead of time. We were just catching up, and I was making some announcements for new folks. Obviously, some folks will watch this later, but for the benefit of it being available, is just making some announcements, right? So we, as the ticker says, right, we're going to meet every Monday and Thursday. I'll be better about sending out the live stream link. A way to avoid that confusion is to subscribe to the channel. I'm not a social media anything. The only reason I'm asking you or suggesting even that you subscribe is because you can set up announcements for scheduled events and live events, and you'll automatically get the link. So you should automatically be able to go into your YouTube subscriptions, click on the channel, and find us without having to wait on a link. So that'll be helpful for you, and also allow us to use this technology a little more efficiently. Okay, important announcement as well, and I'll send this out as well over Blackboard, and you also have access to this in the syllabus and the course schedule. But there is an important assignment due next Friday. So in addition to our reading annotations, right, we're doing a few other projects, right, a few other assignments, and the first our final project is a project in phases, partially because I want to help you do well in the final version of your project. So I'm breaking it up into pieces so that it's not totally overwhelming. But what that means is on Friday, the very first part of your project is due. And that is relatively simple, but I want you to start thinking about it now so that you have options to sort of go back and forth and decide what you want to do, right? We're doing digital ethnography. We'll talk more about methodology for that and everything next week and as we go along. But for next week's assignment, you just need to pick your digital community, right? What digital community do you want to do an ethnographic project with or about, right? So, and what platform where are you going to find that digital community, right? Hi, everybody. So what digital community, where you're going to find that digital community, and what question about that digital community you have, right? What's your research question? What's going to frame the focus of your final project, right? So what about this digital community is interesting to you, and what kind of question, what kind of anthropological question do you want to ask? Right. So I want you to start thinking about this now. It's due on Friday of next week, right? So not today, not tomorrow, but Friday of next week. So I just want you to start thinking about it now. Again, the due date is available. That the information is available on Blackboard. You can look at it under the assignment under contents, right? So there's a final project or final ethnographic project folder. You click in there and you'll see all of the different sort of sub-due dates, right? So the first one being on Friday. So digital communities, right, are where people are joined together online. So an example might be K-pop fans, right? And you might find them on Twitter, for example. Maybe you are interested in, I don't know, the women's powerlifting community, and you want to find them on Reddit or Instagram, right? So these are digital communities. Maybe you want to find what homesteaders are doing, right, as a digital community, right, where they come together and talk about homesteading things, right? There's been a huge push in homesteading, and there are lots of variations, or like I don't want to call them factions, right? That's not the right word, but there are sort of lots of subdivisions within what we might term the homesteading community. So there's a lot of variation within that, for example. Yeah, just lots of options. So you might want to take a look at some things. It can be some, you can look at the way that a particular generation is using, so if you want to look at the way that boomers are, and how are you going to identify them as boomers, all of those kinds of things you're going to have to think about to clarify, right? But how are boomers using TikTok, or something like that, right? So these are the digital communities, right, where we have where we are living our lives in the digital realm, right? So we're going to do some readings specifically about that next week, which will help you. And you can also read ahead if you like. As you have questions, feel free to reach out and ask them. I'm going to try to put together some frequently asked questions, and I'm going to add a little bit of clarification as well to the assignment section in Blackboard, but that'll be available to you. All right, let's get going on the actual lecture part of today. I did not mean to eat in quite so much time, but that is all right. We will persevere. And whatever we don't get to today, we'll just cover on Monday. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. And let's talk about more anthropological stuff. So let me share my screen here and get our, hold on. Let me just, here we go. Sorry, just making sure it was on the right slide, so we're going to avoid confusion. Okay, so today we're going to talk about ethnography, right? So what this methodology of anthropology is, which is going to be relevant as well to your final project, right? And as you're thinking about your final project, you'll have been doing a great job on the readings and your annotations, and you're asking really great questions and doing some really solid analysis in your discussions. So that is going to be really helpful as we move through the rest of the semester and as you start sort of thinking about doing your own digital ethnography, right? We're going to talk about the terms emic and etic, positionality, epistemology. One of my personal favorites is the conversation about epistemology, and storytelling and narratives. If we have time, I'm not sure that we're going to have time to get there, but we will definitely talk about it next week if we don't get to it today. So, ethnography. What in the world is it, right? Let's think about it holistically, right, as the sum of its parts. You can go back and look at the earlier parts of the video just for time. I'm not going to go over it again, but you can look in Blackboard to see where the final project description is, also in the syllabus under the assignments. So you can also go to the frequently asked questions. I just updated it, so it should say FAQs on your sidebar, but you can look in the FAQs under grading and assignments to find out more about the assignments for class that are in addition to the annotations and readings. If the earlier explanation and that information doesn't clarify for you, feel free to circle back and send me an email or schedule office hours, and we can talk about it, right? So ethnography, the sum of its parts. I'm going to take this ticker off real quick so that we don't have to worry about that. And right, so ethno, referring to culture, or ethnicity, right? Ethnocentrism or ethnomusicology, right? So we're talking about culture. And then graph, right? Referring to writing. So think about epigraphs or monographs, calligraphy, right? Graph. It's refers to writing, right? So an ethnography is writing about culture, right? And this is one of the primary methodologies of anthropology. Sociology also use it. Sociology is our sister from another mister, and so we came from the same disciplinary and academic origins, and so we share a lot of methodologies. Traditionally, anthropology was the study of other cultures, outside cultures, and sociology was the study of domestic society, so a society in which you lived. But that is changing dramatically, right? So sociologists go outside and look at, go outside of their domestic areas, right, outside of their national origins, to do sociology. And anthropologists are increasingly looking at their societies of origin in order to talk about culture. And a lot of that has to do with the way that our world has gotten much smaller in terms of travel and the ways that different groups are intermingling and all in the same place at the same time often, right? Or are able are available digitally, right? Okay, so let's get some perspective, right? So you talked about ethnography, and that's a really sort of stripped down version of it, but it's writing about culture or writing culture, and I'll talk about the distinctions later, right? So etic, right? Etic means, right, an outsider perspective. So someone who has an outsider perspective, right, for example, would be Laura Bohannon. I misspelled her name. That should be an A. Bohannon, studying among the TIV, right? So an American with European English graduate studies background, going to Nigeria and studying among the TIV, right? So that is one, right, so an outsider perspective. And then you have emic, right, which is the insider perspective. So examples of this are going to be Horace Minor. Sorry, my coffee hasn't quite kicked in. Horace Minor talking about Americans, right? But what's really interesting, right, is that he was writing about that from an Etic perspective, right? So he talked about it as though he was an outsider looking in at a different culture group, right? And this was to make a point about writing culture, right? So we talked about that a little bit on Monday, and you all talked about this, and I commented in perusal on our readings, right, about how he was doing that, right, and how he was sort of making some critiques and commentary about the way in that period, right, anthropology was still being practiced, right? So another example is Zora Neale Hurston studying Black folklore in Florida, right? So she's writing from an insider perspective in a lot of ways as someone who grew up in the place that she's studying, right? But she also demonstrates, right, pretty early on and pretty quickly that there are also some things about her that make her outside, right? So that give her a sort of Oedic perspective, even from within her own member community, right? So let's think about the ways that people are, and not just people, right? Emic and Oedic don't just refer to the position of the researcher vis-a-vis the research community, right? It can also be sort of relational to other factors, right? So my top tip for remembering which is which, right? Oedic is outside, right? It's got the T, so pay attention there. And emic is a member of the group, right? So there's the M. So if you ever have trouble remembering Oedic and emic, that's my 5-cent mnemonic for how to remember the difference. But keep these, so as we're talking about these, keep these things in mind as you're reading the articles, and all of our articles throughout the semester, right? What is the perspective of the researcher? Is it known? Have they made it clear, right? What kind of, are you a member group of something that is being talked about, or do you have some sort of emic insight, right? Or is it a fully Oedic experience for you, right? Is this, so what's the relationship of the researcher to the research? What's your relationship to what's being talked about? What is the relationship of the researcher to the topic, right? So maybe not necessarily the place, but the topic. Maybe this is something that is auto-ethnographic, self-ethnographic for them as well, right? In some way. So those are some things to keep in mind. All right, so let's talk about positionality, right? Positionality is so important. So context is key, right? What we mean by positionality, right? And this also, so there are some corollaries, some related concepts in sort of popular language and our everyday lives, right? So positionality is the position of the researcher. It's the identity of the researcher, and what all that brings to the research. So some of you were starting to talk about this in perusal, right, on both Hurston's piece and on Bohannon's piece, right? How their perceptions or their identities, right? Or their relation to the topic, their relationship to the topic would or wouldn't influence, or maybe how it would influence, right? And so some of you expressed concern about bias, right? And some of you expressed concern or interest, right, in the auto-ethnographic components, or the ways that this was affecting the researcher, or the way that the researcher might be interpreting things because of their relationship to a particular topic, right? So for Bohannon, her strange relationship with Hamlet. And I say that not because having interest in Hamlet is weird. I am an absolute Shakespeare nut, and have been for my entire life. Fun fact, I was a participant, an actor in the Texas Shakespeare Festival many, many years ago. But me and my acting partner won first place that year. So cool stuff. And I'm really, really into Shakespeare. But I'm also really of the mind, right, that as some of you pointed out, right, literature has multiple meanings and multiple interpretations. And the authors often intended it that way. Shakespeare especially, right? It can correlate to bias, but not necessarily, right? So I'll talk about that momentarily. But Shakespeare in particular, right? So it's something that I find fascinating about that particular reading and interaction is that, and the obnoxiousness of her friend at Oxford, right? Is that Shakespeare himself minced words intentionally, right? He intentionally used a play on words to say something that seemed explicit while often meaning something entirely different. And he did talk about the relationships of families and the relationships of individuals, but he was also often really talking about aristocracy in particular, and kind of poking fun at it and making jabs. So this idea that there is only one meaning or one interpretation of it is not really in line with the essence of Shakespeare itself, right? And any Shakespearean actor or Shakespearean theater group, right, would absolutely tell you that. And you can see that in the different variations of the way that those stories have been retold in different formats, in different places, right? Okay, so how positionality correlates to bias, right? What we're talking about when we're talking about positionality is sort of the identity of the researcher, right? But also not just the identity, right? But where they were trained, what traditions they are trained in, sort of what ideas they hold together. And this will make a little more sense too when we get to epistemology, right? We'll have the big epiphanies. But essentially, right, who were the researchers and how might that affect their research, right? So for example, Horace Minor, he's a white American man, right? An anthropologist. He was also a spy during World War II, right? If you want to go down a fun rabbit hole, I will post some supplemental optional readings up in the general discussion on perusal, and you can read about the controversy of anthropologists as spies. There are always a few among us who use our skills somewhat dubiously. And I say dubiously because being a spy involves surreptitiously gathering information and then using that information to support power. And power may not be, and that may not be in the best interest of the people whose trust is being forsaken, right? And so there are a lot of ethical issues around presenting oneself as an anthropologist only to collect sensitive information that people have entrusted you with, right? And entrusted you with based on what you told them you were going to do with it, and then you turn around and give that information away or sell that information, right, as a spy, to actually work in their detriment, right? So that's a huge problem, right? It's a big ethical issue, but nonetheless, it was very, very frequent. And actually, I mean, you're all at American University. You know that the CIA comes to campus and recruits. They've recruited from American University for a really long time, so it's not uncommon, right? Still for and if you ever go and look on their job site, right, you'll see that they explicitly hire anthropologists all the time. So it happens, but it is not uncontroversial within the discipline, right? So if you want to explore that a little bit, you can. But how does this affect their research, right? Or how does it affect their research communities? This positionality is really important. So for Horace Minor, what we're talking about, right, is that he's a white American man, an anthropologist, and for the reading that we did, right, he was studying Americans, right? So he has an emic perspective. He can use his knowledge, right, about himself to make these sort of assessments. But what's really interesting, right, is that he used that also to make a critique on anthropology, which for someone else in his position might have been less possible, right? Less acceptable. If he were, say, a woman, or he were a person of color, for example, right? So to that point, right, Laura Bohannon, white American woman, although she spent a lot of time in England and studied at Oxford, right? So birthologist, oh my gosh, that should say anthropologist. Her birthplace was unknown. Sorry about that. I was doing editing on mobile devices in addition to on my laptop. And so apparently I missed a couple of things when I was doing final reviews yesterday. Oops. I'll correct that. But she did her undergrad in Arizona and her graduate degree from Oxford, right? So that's going to have influenced a particular, her way of conducting research is going to influence her sort of cultural perspectives. And the fact that she's white, studying among an indigenous Black community, right? In Black African community in Nigeria, right? Gives us some sense of how outside she is, right? So that is one of the more explicit ways in which we start seeing, okay, what's going, what is the researcher bringing to this, right? And so some of you pointed out too in Shakespeare in the Bush, right? Right. What you were starting to circle around is this idea of positionality. What biases does the researcher bring, right? What biases does her colleague have about the TIV, right? People who live in the bush, right? And not necessarily saying that in a way that is acknowledging that people live in a place called the bush, but that that there's this negative connotation, right? Or this hierarchical or this colonialist connotation that because they live in bush, they are somehow, and because they are remote or rural, right? They are somehow less educated. They are somehow less capable of comprehending high art such as Shakespeare, right? That they are too different, right? And ultimately, right, there's the insinuation that they're primitive, right? Which is super problematic. But this, so one anthropological training prior to fairly recently, frankly, prior to like the 1980s and the mid to late 80s at that, really didn't look a lot at that positionality, and really didn't hadn't reckoned with their colonialist and their sort of ethnocentric biases, right? So this is what we mean when we talk about positionality, and we have to think about positionality for everyone, right? The ways that their experiences, their identity. So being a woman, being a white woman, right? In a so being different in a place where there's a gender hierarchy, right? And or there are really specific gendered norms, right, where there are activities in which women just can't participate in. But if you are a researcher who identifies or who is identified as a woman, and you want to research these communities, right, or this some sort of gendered aspect within a community, that can be really complicating, right, to overcome and to also still conduct your research, right? So similarly, right, Zora Neale Hurston, Black American woman, right, from the U.S. South, right? And so as Laura Bohannon went to undergrad in Arizona, we don't know what her birthplace is, but the Southwest is culturally very different from the Deep South in the ways that we sort of geographically talk about the United States and sort of our regional cultures. I am from Southeast Texas, which is also considered part of the Deep South, but it's also very different from Floridian South. Not too crazily different, but there are some substantial differences, right? But so I grew up in the Deep South, and those experiences definitely have impacted and influenced how I see the world, or the different kinds of things I know about the world, right? And then what I bring with me to my research when I do my research, right? And taught me a lot about myself as a researcher, right? And as a person, just in general. I also spent a lot of time in the Midwest, so I identify a lot with some Midwestern practices. And now I live in DC and have for the past almost 10 years now. So I've lived here a long time, and it's all of those different factors sort of influence how I come to a topic. So I will, I have the ability to sort of help those of you who are not familiar with the Deep South, right, or the U.S. South in general, to give you some perspective on it, and help you interpret things that you may not be fully aware of. We're going to talk a little bit at length about Zora Neale Hurston's positionality, and the context for her research, which will help answer, I think, some of the questions that you all were posing in the readings, and some of the comments that you had that were just like, when is this taking place? What is the context of this? But it will also sort of help you show help show you the positionality of the researcher, right? So importantly, Zora Neale Hurston she wasn't just an anthropologist, right? Or that wasn't the only thing that she did. She was actually a prolific writer. And so she was an author of novels, plays, poems, essays, short stories. She was also a filmmaker, and she was very accomplished, and is really celebrated, right? Although she's not typically part of, or she's often not included as part of the anthropological canon, again, because of some of those old lingering issues of colonialism and the overwhelming whiteness of anthropology historically, and that is still undergoing a lot of change right now. It looks very different now than it did 20 years ago, but it's still an overwhelmingly white space, as are many spaces. But we'll talk about that, right? But it's also one of the reasons why when she was doing her research and then writing in 1935, right, or when it was published, so she was probably writing, the year before that or a couple of years prior. Think about what was going on in the United States in the 1930s, right? The early 1920s, early 1930s, and what it meant to be a Black woman studying in the North, right? And not just studying, right? Not just going to school, but going to undergrad and then going to grad school as a Black woman in the United States in the 1930s. And a Black woman from the South, right? There's a lot in her positionality, right, to take into consideration. So we're going to watch a quick little film. It may not allow me to keep this in the recording if for any reason I have to scrub it. We'll still be able to watch it, but we're going to watch it now, and I'll post the link so that you all have access to it. But this seems to be pretty open access. So, but this is about, I'm gonna pause it real quick. This is about Eatonville, the place where she conducted her study. So it's going to provide a historical overview and talk a little bit about some of the things. So I'm gonna let y'all watch this, and we'll come back and talk about it in just a few minutes.
Good afternoon. I'm Jasmine Reese, the neighborhood coordinator for the historic town of Eatonville.
Every day, the city's
It was not the first Negro community in America, but it was the first to be incorporated, the first attempt at organized self-government on the part of Negroes in America.
But for all there is to celebrate, the city's 2,200 residents have long struggled with poverty, unemployment, and a rate of diabetes 3 times the national average. Today, community leaders are banding together to build a culture of health upon Eatonville's strong foundation by embracing its history and building its future through creating jobs, improving educational outcomes, and empowering residents.
Eatonville is a quintessential American town. It has its own special uniqueness in terms of character and spirit.
There's this sense of family throughout that everybody is your extended mother, your extended father, your extended grandmother.
The community has reduced crime. It has brought in new businesses and new stores. It's changed so much that you can see it in the people's hearts and their actions and the way that they live.
Good afternoon. I'm Jasmine Reese, the neighborhood coordinator for the historic town of Eatonville.
Every day, there are people that come to Eatonville. I tell them, you have just walked in the city limits of history.
I enjoy educating people and exposing them to my home and to what took place in the past and what's happening now, all of the development, the changes in government. It's inspiring.
I am the executive director of the Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community, Incorporated. We are what is identified as a cultural tourism heritage success story. Eatonville is known really around the world as a literary destination because of Zora Neale Hurston, the 20th century folklorist, anthropologist, and writer, because she comes out of this community and celebrates this community. When people know who they are, they know of their history, how they fit into that history, it allows for a kind of security, a kind of emotional stability.
To me, it means pride in who you are and where you're going and where you want to be in life and what you want to do.
It's important that we keep telling the story, because if you stop telling the story, people can't dream anymore.
The culture of health is a 360 approach if you're going to truly have a healthy community. It's not just about medicine. It is about your spiritual environment. It is about economics.
It's important for businesses to partner with community because any town's progression and growth is really economic development.
Postdine is a store of information that goes across the world. And they decided that Eatonville was going to be their home.
There's going to be a lot of non-technical jobs available. So we want to open up job opportunity to the town of Eatonville.
One of the neat things about it, every home in Eatonville will have free Wi-Fi. So I think it's going to be a win-win for our community and our economic base to have these new businesses that are starting to come in.
The Wayne Denge Center has provided transitional and supportive housing for homeless individuals and people with disabilities with supportive services behind the scenes to support people's growth.
Didn't have a job and I ain't have no income, but Miss Carol trusted me and let me in here anyway. She gave me a place where nobody else would, you know. People don't do that every day.
We formed a partnership with Florida Hospital and Ability Housing, and the community and Orange County have invested in rehabbing our entire properties. We've established a new lifeline here in Eatonville, able to provide affordable housing at reasonable costs based on income to help people get their first home, their first housing in the community.
When I found out that I had diabetes, I reached out to the American Diabetes Association and I said, I think there's a problem with diabetes in my town. They sent UCF here. They did a study where they went door to door and they talked to a lot of people and found out that there was almost 25% diabetes within the community. And that was unbelievable. Together, we decided something needed to be done.
Healthy Eatonville Place is a health and wellness community here in Eatonville, Florida. We provide diabetic classes and we are teaching them about how to prevent diabetes and how to manage their diabetes by checking their blood sugars, what food.
Okay, you can watch the rest of the film or the last 5 minutes of the film a little bit later, but I just wanted to give you sort of a sense of why Eatonville is historically really important. And even before this video was made, obviously in the recent in recent years, right, in contemporary contexts, Eatonville was already a really important place in Florida, in the U.S. South, because it was a fully incorporated town that was entirely Black, right? And it was not uncommon to have a lot of places that were in the South that were still sort of segregated by living, but this town was fully incorporated, governed itself, and was governed by Black individuals who had been formerly enslaved or who and then generations afterwards, right, who were not who had not been enslaved, but whose family members, right, had been part of that part of that system, that economic system, right, part of the system of slavery. So that gives us a little more context about why. Let me get the screen share back up here for the slides. Gives us a little more context about Eatonville and why it was an important place for Zora Neale Hurston to conduct her research, right? That context is also important, right? But other researchers, right, without Hurston's, oops, let's jump to other researchers without Hurston's background, right, might not have known about Eatonville or might not have cared, frankly, about Eatonville. But if you want to study Black folklore, right, where better to go than a place where people who know Black folklore and who keep those who keep the folklore alive, right? For whom it is still important and is still part of a daily part of life, right? Where better to go than a place like Eatonville, right? So making the strange familiar and the familiar strange, right? This is something that anthropologists strive to do. It's something that Miner's trying to do. It's something that Bohannon's trying to do, and it's something that Hurston tries to do, all in their own way. But these are ways that give us some idea, some new idea about something that was either known to us, but not known to us in this way that it's now presented, or was unknown to us and now seems like it's an indispensable part of our lives, right? Or that we cannot unknow it, right? So with the Nasarema, right? It's written about by an American, about Americans. Good gracious, that editing on my mobile device is not my favorite thing. Written about Americans by an American, but from the perspective of an Edic observer, right, as we talked about before, to help us think through the ways that our behaviors and everyday rituals are bizarre, or might be perceived as bizarre, right? And also to critique the discipline for writing culture in a predictable and problematic way, right? There have been a couple of recent articles in the Washington Post that tried to talk about the United States in the same way that the United States talks about other places with regard to current events. And those are some good examples of some good sort of popular examples of the ways that writing is predictable, right? So we can then imitate that writing, or we can then use the tropes of that writing to make a point, right? Some of the other things that are, some of the other rituals, right, that we think of that might be bizarre, right? So, I mean, he even got down to the nitty gritty of like brushing our teeth, describing toothbrushes. Way back in the early part of the 20th century, toothbrushes were still made often with coarse animal hair. Because we didn't have plastics, right? So what did we use before plastics? Brushes were often made with hair, the brushes for one's hair, and toothbrushes, were made with horsehair. So when he was talking about boar's hair, putting, coarse pig's hair, right, bristles in the mouth to brush the teeth, right? He wasn't exaggerating. That's actually a way that toothbrushes were made at one point, right? Which is kind of bizarre, right? But also not at all bizarre. It's really mundane, right? Like we figure out ways to use the things around us to as tools and as resources, right? So in that way, it's not bizarre at all. But in that way, it's also really quite strange. So this is some of the way that we make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. For Bohannon, right, Shakespeare in the Bush, the Edic observer of the Tiv gets Edic analysis of English literature, right? So the roles and the importance, right, of that's not what I want. I want this one. Yep. Okay. Of each individual, right, or each set of actors, right, is sort of flipped on its head, and the analysis is also sort of flipped on its head. So that's a fun thing in some of the writing, and a way also that, right. So if you are familiar with Hamlet, right? You potentially got a new perspective on Hamlet, or a different way to think about it, and a comparative way to say, oh, okay, so like there are there's this other interpretation that makes a kind of sense, right? Or makes all the sense in the world potentially, right? Depending on who you are, and sort of where your your worldview falls, right? What you know to be true, or a little t true, right? And what you know to be valuable and important. Oh, we're running out of time today. That's all right. That's all right. We'll catch up anything that we don't get to. So the Tiv elders also give us a context that reflects their own lives in the story, right? So their positionality comes to bear on how they interpret the behaviors of their researcher, right? Of the person who's, come into their lives, potentially uninvited, but they seem to have a decent rapport. And to establish a better rapport as the story unfolds, right? But they also bring their worldview, right? So they don't have the equivalent of ghosts in their worldview, potentially because it doesn't serve a useful function, right? Their grieving practices may be such that it doesn't make sense to have ghosts, or their relationships with people in life may be such that they don't need the idea of ghost doesn't serve a function, right? Right, in the same way that in Iceland, right, folklore, but also present day, it is not uncommon for a majority of Icelandic people to believe or to talk about fairies or sprites on the island, and because they serve an important cultural function in Icelandic, not only folklore but sort of day-to-day lives, and in somewhere like the United States, that's considered fanciful or silly, and may not resonate or serve a cultural function. And so we just don't have the equivalent of that. Or if we do, it's like a storybook thing and it's not really real, right? It doesn't mean that it's not culturally significant or real in some other place, right? So this is the same idea, or the same sort of idea at work, right? So a way to familiarize ourselves with these unfamiliar things and make them seem, not just make them seem, but really bring them to life in a way that is useful for everyone, right? So in Mules and Men, in the chapters that you read, right, Hurston is giving an emic perspective of African-American folklore, but at the time, and still, and so I say African-American, but also, right, so it's not just African-American Black folklore, but there's also some Caribbean experience and Caribbean folklore in some of the work that she does and in Mules and Men. But in the particular chapters that you read, she was looking specifically at African-American folklore. You will notice that I do not use the same language that is used in the book to talk about these things, because times have changed. At the time, African-American wasn't a concept, right? That concept didn't, that identity or that identity marker didn't actually come into play and into use until the late 1980s, or maybe the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s in the United States. Black also is a more contemporary terminology. At one point, Black was also really problematic, but it has since changed. And so acknowledging Blackness, right, is really important. But there are being Black and African, being Black and Latin American, right, being Afro-Latino or Afro-Latinx, and being Black and African American it can all be very different. So if we're talking about Black folklore, right, in this case, I'm talking about African American and Caribbean folklore. Hurston is talking about those things, right? But at the time, the word Negro was still the term used. Today, it is considered, particularly if you are not a person of color, it is considered a slur or demeaning. And so you will not hear me use it, except for in the context in which I just did. So we'll talk more about the importance of paying attention to language and the ways that language evolves. And so some of the terminology that you hear, right, again, it's important to think about the positionality and to think about the historical context of when something was being written. What were the words that were acceptable or normal to use, right? And that will also help you identify in contemporary and even in older literature when an anthropologist is using really problematic language, right? When they should know better, when there are different conventions, when there are better ways to talk about things more respectfully. With a holistic perspective that considers everything that has happened and all of the context and the effects of our words, right? Let's see. Right, we talked about this. So she also demonstrates that even researchers with an inside perspective are often still outside. I don't want to run over time too much, but I do want to say, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, and some of y'all were starting to come up with, to get around this idea on your annotations and discussion questions, and I'll chime in a little bit more and talk about this, but we're going to talk about it more throughout the semester. One of the reasons that she was outside, and one of the reasons why she felt outsider, was it. Not that it was looked down upon in her community to go get an education necessarily, right? There may have been some sexism at play there because it's still 1935 and there's still a lot of ideas about, women going off to college and getting an education. And she was going to college in the early 20s. And grad school, in the mid to late 20s. So think about that time, right? Like suffrage for suffrage for white women hadn't happened yet until the late teens, early 20s, and then suffrage for Black women didn't happen for still quite a while longer, right? So ideas about women's place in society, especially a Black woman's place in society, were still pretty heavy. So the fact that she went to university and went to grad school speaks volumes about her tenacity and perseverance. But also, right, it speaks volumes about her class, potentially, right? Her ability to go to university, to leave her home community and have the resources and access to go to college and make a life for herself. Right. And so we're going to get into the politics of respectability, and we'll also get into sort of some of the racialized politics, but also within groups, sort of how that gets talked about and how that plays out. So it's not so much that people from her community are closed-minded or from Eatonville, right? Or from any rural community, right? Like even the TIV, right? So I want us to avoid getting into the idea that because a place is rural or because it is remote, that people don't travel or don't want to travel. They just may do so in a way that is different. But we also have to remember where the narratives are coming from. They are coming from other people who are interpreting how people do or don't, or who are representing how people do or don't live in a particular way. And so that may not always be, it often is not, indicative of the way that people are. There are certainly reasons that people stay in one place or don't want to travel, right? But it's not necessarily because they're closed-minded or because it's not in their nature. We're also going to trouble the idea of what is natural, right? Or what is human nature. We might say more appropriately or more accurately that something is human rather than that it is human nature, right? Because nature in and of itself is constructed, right? But we'll get into that. So I really wanted to talk about epistemology today, but we don't have time. So we will talk about it on Monday when we live stream again at 9 a.m. Or you can always check the video, the recording afterwards. They'll be on Blackboard and they'll be on Perusal. Remember that if you look at them on Perusal, you can scan and ask questions or make notes and annotate and participate with your classmates who ask questions. Although there weren't a whole lot of questions today. But that's okay. We have options and ways to do that. So we will meet again on Monday at 9 a.m. If you haven't subscribed to the broadcast or to the channel, I strongly recommend that, just because you'll get notifications when I schedule the live stream, and then you'll get notifications when we go live. So you should be able to click in even if I am late sending out the live stream link, or if there's some other reason that that makes it easy. So I mentioned at the very beginning of the video some details about the final project, the component of the ethnographic project assignment that is due next Friday. So not this Friday, but next Friday. I'll post more information in Blackboard. There's already the assignment posted in Blackboard under the digital ethnography project folder. So you can find more information there. No problem. Thank you guys. So you need to pick a digital community, right? So for example, K-pop fans, right? Or I don't know. They're just so many. K-pop fans comes to mind because there was some recent flurry on Twitter, right? So you need to find a digital community, and the digital platform or the digital space in which they meet and talk and do whatever and live, right? That you're going to observe. And then you need to pose a research question. What about this digital community are you going to research, right? What do you want to find out about this digital community? So we're going to build your final project in phases. The first step is obviously picking your digital field site and picking your research question. Okay, so more information about that later. Thank you all very, very much. I'm going to end the broadcast now. And if you have questions or need anything, please feel free to schedule office hours. The link is up in Blackboard under content. There's a direct link now, so it should be much easier to find. And of course, you can email me. But if you want to chat via video, please just send a Calendly link or a Calendly make a Calendly appointment. It'll automatically populate in Google Meet, and we'll be able to meet there. So thank you all very much. We'll get more into the nitty-gritty of this stuff on Monday. And in the meantime, have a great rest of your week. Have a great rest of your classes this week. Try to give yourself at least one day to rest. And if you can't, give yourself at least, a little bit of time to rest and come back refreshed on Monday. We'll see ya. Thanks. Bye.